Hi, thank you for having me here in this cybersecurity summit. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody, depending on which time zone you're in today. So today, actually, I wanted to share my thoughts around vulnerability management program that we have actually implemented at Verana Health. And I basically have like a short agenda to start off with, where I basically start off with the vulnerability management challenges that we actually faced initially when we started off this program, and then move on to what is our approach, how did we go about implementing this, and then what are the improvements that we have seen or made in the last couple of years, and then move on to what are our next steps in the security journey, which always keeps continuing. So let me actually start with actually I'm going to first actually I'm going to first start with this one. So let me just tell you a little bit about Verana Health itself. So Verana Health is actually it's a digital health company. It's a digital health analytics company, and they basically focus more on deriving data and insights that helps drive progress into using real world evidence and data to enhance the quality of care and the life of our patients. So within our data sets, we basically deal with a lot of PHI and PII information. And that's why it's extremely important for us to ensure that we are building a strong security program that actually protects all of this data that we actually are working with. My role, particularly, I'm the security and compliance director at Verana Health. I'm particularly responsible, and my team basically focuses on various areas like cloud security. We do a lot of security architecture reviews. We're working on securing our data pipelines and compliance programs that we actually run. We work on high trust and other being HIPAA compliant and any other say health related compliance programs that we have to work with. And then we also basically ensure that we have we work with certain security frameworks like the NIST 800-53 and BSIM frameworks to ensure that we actually are putting out more secure products out there. Part of my responsibility is not just driving the program, but it's also ensuring awareness throughout the organization and informing and enabling critical business initiatives. So let me go back here. So let me start with Verana Health. When I started with Verana Health about 5 years ago. When I started, we were a very small team, probably extremely small team that we were actually working with. And we actually had to go ahead and start setting up this program. And one of the first things that we wanted to start off with was like, okay, what are the different challenges that we are going to we had to basically figure out what are the gaps that we actually had to look at and what are the challenges that we were actually facing. So the number one thing that we were facing was a lack of unified views of vulnerabilities. And what I mean by that is we actually go ahead and scan different types of vulnerabilities. So you have open source vulnerabilities, you have infrastructure vulnerabilities, you have web application security vulnerabilities that we are actually scanning. How do you basically provide, you have all of these vulnerabilities coming from different sources, and how do you basically provide a single pane of glass for different people or different developers or engineering or business teams to give them like a unified view of all of these vulnerabilities so that they can actually effectively look at these vulnerabilities and basically start to resolve some of these items. This was Combine this with some of the ever-changing business priorities within a startup, being in a startup, it can be basically very challenging. So how do we actually become very efficient in providing a unified view, and how do we basically dissipate that information in a language that everybody understands? And that was something that was a very big challenge. And how do you also educate some of these people around the culture of security? And how do you basically tell them that this is basically important and help them meet some of these goals that we are actually trying to meet internally as well? The second piece that which I'm pretty sure, I think a lot of a lot of people, a lot of you basically face here is basically asset management. As you know, I mean, asset management is extremely important. You need to know what you have to actually protect or monitor. um, when we started off initially, everybody was basically working, we work in a cloud environment. We basically had just one account. People were basically trying to use just what that one account to actually start using, start all of their projects and start building all of their projects. But as our company started growing and as our team basically scaled, we had to basically ensure that we were having a proper account structure in place for all of these engineering teams so that it could go through the proper software development lifecycle process. And we actually also had to kind of ensure that there was a standardized tagging. And initially, when we started off, none of these things were actually available. So it was quite challenging to kind of get a sense of how do we actually categorize, what is the risk that we actually put to some of these assets, and how do we basically make sure that some of these the tagging is actually standardized basically across the board as we actually scale. The third one that we actually faced was the lack of risk correlation. So like I was talking about in the lack of unified view, right? We actually have multiple different sources that's actually feeding into our systems, but it's not just those multiple different sources of vulnerabilities. It's also what is important to the business, what is important to the team. And typically you want to be able to correlate the when you're communicating risk, you want to basically look at, of course, vulnerability risk, but you also want to look at what's the risk that the business is going to face, and if we basically don't fix it, then what's the impact that it's basically going to have. So to be able to prioritize these vulnerabilities correctly, and what needs to get fixed, how do we actually make the remediation process efficient with a very small team, and how do we basically make sure that there's attention being brought to the riskier vulnerabilities or to the riskier problems that we're actually facing within our product. And that's the part that the lack of risk correlation was something which was very heavy within our systems. And as a follow-up to that, it was how do we basically communicate this risk to our business and technical owners. Usually you want to have like very, you want to kind of tailor your conversation to the audience that you're actually speaking to, but at the same time you want to make sure that your team is actually unified across the board and you're actually communicating the same message. So how do you kind of have a way to quantify some of this risk? Because a lot of us are data driven. We want to have a data driven decision that we're actually making when we are communicating all of this. So how do you actually communicate some of this risk to business owners, to our executive leadership team, the board, the technical owners, the developers who are actually kind of working day in and day out to actually fix some of these? How do you actually go ahead and communicate in the most effective and the most clear and concise manner? The fifth one that we did see was vulnerability and patch management fatigue. I mean, you've seen like there are so many vulnerabilities that come at any point in time. And this is an issue that is prevalent across different companies. And we've tried to kind of use different techniques to kind of reduce the fatigue of both, finding the vulnerabilities and also patching them. But it is still an issue. It is still something which goes on for continuous improvement. So it's always the big question always comes back to us, like, are we basically doing a good job of tracking some of these vulnerabilities? Are we basically overloading the teams for patching some of these vulnerabilities? How do we effectively prioritize these vulnerabilities based on based on the risk that the product is actually facing, and how do we actually make sure that we are actually fixing within the SLA that actually has been defined, and how do we assign the resources to do the same? So this is something that is extremely prevalent. It's still a work in progress, but this was something that we saw initially as well, compounding to our problems. The next one is culture. I have to say, culture is extremely important. I mean, educating teams, ensuring that there's a top-down culture of security from the top, right? That if the leadership team, the board, everybody understands the essence and how the importance of being secure and the importance of why this is basically important, especially in a healthcare company like us. So it's one of the biggest things that we basically saw was, we are working in a startup, we are working at a very fast pace. And many times our priorities are changing as well. So given this fast moving pace, what is the fastest and most efficient way that we can actually dissipate this education to everybody and communicate the required risk so that we get the required amount of importance to fix some of the issues that we're actually seeing? We also actually propagate. We also wanted to propagate the concept of shift left, because the sooner you kind of fix it, the better it is. And how do we basically make sure that this is imbibed within the culture, with our developers, with the managers who are actually managing these developers, with the different engineering teams, and with the infrastructure teams that we're actually working with. But it's more about actually building that culture of like, okay, from the get-go, how do we actually build secure code? And also they need to understand like when they should be acting upon it versus when they can actually give it a little bit time and fix it over a period of time. um, the next one actually that we also saw was centralizing. How do we centralize the improved observability into risk? So centralizing and improved observability into risk is more about how do we make it more visible for people to understand that this is the risk you're facing? How do you actually communicate the essence of it as well to all the stakeholders that we are actually working with? And we needed one place where we could basically view all of our risks so that we are ensuring that there is enough correlation between all of these risks, and we are able to communicate the consolidated risk. It's not like a piecemeal risk, but a consolidated risk that we're actually communicating to everybody. So it goes back to that single pane of glass that we're actually providing to the business itself. And the last one, last but not the least, which nobody is probably surprised about, is limited resourcing. Again, a very small team. How do you actually work with some of these teams? There is, if there are new team members who are actually joining in, how do you actually correctly imbibe them into the security culture? How do we handle them? Sometimes you have to handle them because you have to educate them and you have to spend the time. But at the same time, you also want to kind of put in a certain amount of process improvements, and over a period of time hope that the developers will basically pick it up and they'll be able to do some of these things much faster as we put the process gates in place. The biggest thing that actually I've seen is that people do not like surprises. So the more you're very specific about what the kind of processes that you want to put in place, and ensuring that given the limited resources, as specific as you can be, it has seemed to be very, very helpful in actually communicating some of the risk and also some of the work that actually needs to be done to reduce the risk. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about was a risk-based vulnerability management approach. So this was something that we actually wanted to imbibe within our company and within our culture from the get-go. As you can see, all security programs go by risk. It's how you communicate the risk, what exactly the risk is. And there's a lot that goes behind the scenes. It is not about the tools. It is not about the scanning of these tools, and it's not about some of the vulnerabilities that you find. It's a lot more than that. It's about do you know what is in terms of asset awareness, do you know what you're actually trying to protect? Are you able to classify some of these assets into the different categories that you want to be able to do? Are you able to kind of scan everything that's out there? Sometimes you will not be able to scan everything, so how do you actually bring those assets in there so that you're able to get a much bigger coverage of your attack surface as compared to actually having a smaller coverage? The other piece that also comes in is it's so important to actually set up the vulnerability management standards and processes. So what are the policies and what are the procedures, what are the SOPs, the standard operating procedures that you actually want to put in? What are the different roles and responsibilities that you want to define? It's very important actually to define these roles and responsibilities, because everybody, given the fast pace, we actually had to be extremely specific about this is what you're accountable for, this is where you'll be consulted, this is where you need to make sure that this is actually being done. And also communicating some of these SLAs, the SLAs that we actually want these items to be fixed in. If the SLA is not being met, then you're deriving like an exception process and working through with some of these developers. So it's like a continuous process that you're actually working with day in and day out to kind of ensure that we are keeping in check and making sure that our program is working successfully. The other bigger piece is basically monitoring and ticketing and tracking, which is basically, what are the tools that you can actually use, but more importantly, how can you actually use some of these tools to effectively communicate to these teams, and like what's the easiest way for them to be able to take this information and run with it. That's, I think, one of the things that should not take, we wanted to make sure would not take much time. So, initially we had to do a little bit of handholding, but then eventually, once the process is set, it's a lot easier at that point in time. And of course, last but not the least, it's about the metrics and it's about the reporting. So how do you basically communicate the whole status of the whole program to the executives, to the board, and more in a quantifiable fashion, because they basically do like to see numbers and they want to see how well we are actually doing from a risk perspective. The third aspect of this is, of course, the vulnerability testing tools. I mean, as you can see, we do a lot of penetration testing. You do compliance scans, you do code scans, you do infrastructure scans, you do different type of scannings on a regular basis, and you basically want to be able to imbibe or consolidate all of these items and put it into a particular tool or put it into a particular place where you can actually assess what all you need to actually work on. The next one is, of course, risk management. So this is something which is, this is like the tenet or the base of your program, right? So what are the different security frameworks that you actually work with? So in our case, we were working with NIST 800-53. And on top of that, we actually overlaid this with BSIM. BSIM is Building Security and Maturity Model, which is actually specifically used. It actually creates a very nice spider graph, and it gives you a comparison to different companies, how well you're actually doing across different companies as compared to other health companies in either the healthcare sector or the financial sector or other sectors that you're there. And we found it very useful to actually use it to be able to communicate some of our risk to our board, to our executive leadership team, and especially because of the reason that we actually have, it leads to a more data-driven conveyance of our security posture. The other parts of risk management, of course, are like the incident management. How do you set up an incident management? How do you basically work with, as you're monitoring some of your production applications, if you're basically seeing some attacks going on, how do you actually manage through some of these attacks? How do you actually investigate if suppose something actually ended up happening? Things like that. Those are some aspects that you actually have to build as part of this program. The other piece is, of course, threat intelligence, which feeds into this. It is very important for us because it helps us in prioritizing some of our vulnerabilities, depending on what's our exploit maturity. How quickly do we need to? How do we categorize this? Do we have categorize this as a critical or a high or a medium? And also combine that with the business risk. Like is this an internal application, or is that an external application? So some of those other items that are also basically play into that piece as well. And of course, compliance management. Compliance, I mean, we are a healthcare company, so we actually have a lot of high, deep regulations that we actually have to follow. So we have a high trust. We have a couple of other ISO 9001 certifications that we actually have to go through. So how do you basically run through some of these different compliance management programs and then, communicate the risk using that as well. The last but not the least is basically change management. I mean, this is critical, extremely critical area because it's extremely essential for ensuring you are making sure your patch management is being performed at the right cadence. You're basically testing your patches before you're actually applying it, so that you're not breaking anything as part of that. And at the same time, you're also kind of like spending into configuration management, where you're looking at building golden images and ensuring that you actually have things within the golden image that will actually enable hardening of the image and other new features or other use scan tools that you actually want to put as part of that. So this way you're able to basically standardize your images across the organization itself, and at the same time you basically are able to kind of then consolidate some of the vulnerabilities or categorize and group some of the vulnerabilities based on the golden images that are actually being deployed. And at the same time, we also ensure that we are prioritizing these remediation efforts, and any change, and any of these changes that we are, or remediations that we're doing, go through the proper change approval so that you're not disrupting any critical services that we actually have in place. The next thing I actually wanted to quickly dwell upon was, we actually ended up using Vulcan. We actually, when we started the program itself, we basically wanted to kind of see which is the one tool that would actually help cover all the gaps that we were talking about. Some of those gaps that I spoke about is, process related and culture related and everything. So some of those directly don't come into with the tool, but then the tool does help in some way in kind of ensuring that you actually have a way to communicate some of that. So some of the criterias that we actually looked at, we did look at a number of tools, and some of the criterias that we basically looked at was what are the different connectors and the vulnerability assets, sources that we can actually integrate with. That was basically important to us because we had multiple different sources that we were actually coming from, and we wanted to ensure there were proper integrations in place to ensure that there was scanning that was so that we could basically ensure that those could be actually ingested into that one tool that we're looking to basically communicate the risk. The other piece was ensuring that we are able to correctly classify in an easy manner. Asset classification can get very complicated, especially when you put layers on top of it. Like, for example, like you're basically putting things like, this is a production environment. This is something which is actually a PHI related resource, or this is a PII related resource, or this is something that's basically going to sit outside, going to be exposed externally. So some of these items basically kind of, there's a layer of risk that you actually have to put, and how best you can actually communicate that within your asset is something that we were kind of looking at in an easy manner, so that you can actually filter it based on filter using different criterias and be able to communicate risk from a different perspective as well. The other piece was, we wanted to have like a way to classify and not classify, but basically prioritize and track these vulnerabilities. So, having like, certain campaigns, which I'll talk about in the next slide, but basically having automated campaigns that you could basically use to automatically get these vulnerabilities, create Jira tickets so that we could actually start tracking some of these vulnerabilities and be able to kind of assign some of these vulnerabilities and integrate into the sprint processes so that developers could immediately start actually fixing some of these issues. And last but not the least, we basically also wanted to kind of ensure that we basically had proper reporting and analytics, because that is, the essence of what you're actually trying to do, right? Once you've actually finished all of this stuff, you want to be able to quickly report on all of these vulnerabilities and tell people that this is what you're actually trying to that you're actually trying to fix within a certain period of time. So being able to educate our leaders, our managers, that, okay, this is the speed at which the team is actually fixing some of this, and this is the critical, and how do you actually communicate that using some of these reporting mechanisms, and also give them a pat on the back for actually doing a great job of actually fixing some of these things and making sure that these products are secure. The other piece is, of course, the ticketing and reporting piece, like how easy it is to actually, automatically ticket some of these, this thing with the integrations with Jira, and then, how easy it is to kind of track exceptions or any changes or approval that we're actually trying to track. And how can we basically kind of train people with the amount of information that's coming with the vulnerability. So if you're given a vulnerability, what do I do with it? Am I able to get enough information around that vulnerability so that the developer can effectively basically fix it? So focusing a little bit on Vulcan Cyber itself, we used a bunch of different features related to Vulcan that Vulcan actually offered. And I kind of mentioned a little bit of it before. It, the first thing was, of course, the connector integration that we want to be able to connect the different sources. But more importantly, we actually wanted to also be able to contextualize the risk, for the assets. So, having like a single pane of glass for all the assets that we actually are working with, whether they are source code repositories or their infrastructure that we are actually looking at, or there are external, penetration testing vulnerabilities that we are actually looking at. But basically using all of these items and being able to basically prioritize using that. The other piece was, of course, the automated campaign. So, building a campaign for each of the products that we're actually working with. And the cool part was like, of course, them automatically scanning and closing some of these Jira tickets. So you don't have the manual work of actually trying to close some of these tickets yourself. So I think, the amount of automation that the tool can basically offer and help you in making sure that you can actually completely, have some of these vulnerabilities automatically closed once the developer has gone ahead and actually fixed some of these things. And last but not the least, of course, the reporting and the analytics. And I think there's more work that's actually happening on that. But, can we basically, at the very basic level, when we started off with the program, we actually wanted very simple reporting mechanisms, like, how many vulnerabilities are being fixed, what's the SLA for some of these items, what's the risk level of some of these vulnerabilities, which are the teams that are actually working through some of these vulnerabilities, like, which product has more risk versus which product has less risk, and how they are actually tracking towards the last, let's say, 90 days. So all of those things were something that we were basically like focusing, and we wanted to actually have within the tool itself. So after we basically went through, we've had this in we've had this we have this running for the last about a year, and some of the improvements that we basically saw through this whole thing was, like I said, a single pane of glass for our vulnerability risk. This was extremely important for the board, for the executive team, and for the executive team, and for also our board, to kind of like understand what exactly is the risk that the basically company is running, and how do we actually communicate the security posture for the company itself. The second thing we also saw was patching the most relevant vulnerabilities. So this is basically based on the threat intelligence that we got from the tool, and also combining that with some of our business risks that we actually had put in place, and combining those two and providing some of those items, and giving the most relevant vulnerabilities that need to be fixed early on, so that it was more effective remediation. The third one was, of course, context-based risk and prioritization. How do you actually quickly prioritize some of this risk, some of the vulnerabilities, and how do you actually provide the context around that risk? Being able to educate that and being able to prioritize these vulnerabilities based on that. And then, of course, being able to kind of track and report and communicate these metrics based on the risk and prioritizations that we have actually done to all of these different stakeholders that we are actually working through. And we also wanted to ensure that we were able to educate all of these teams, and not just our individual day-to-day teams that we are actually working with, but also our executives and our board on some of these vulnerabilities that we are actually finding, that we are actually finding within our products. So how do you actually educate some of these teams, and how do you basically make sure that they can actually they understand the risk that we are dealing with? And of course, last but not the least, the automation of the issue tracking and the resolution. I think I spoke about that briefly in the previous slide, but it's more about how can it automatically just run through the campaign, and it's just continuously monitoring, and it's continuously resolving some of the issues that we're actually finding, and then giving us a sense of how much more that needs to be done, or how much has actually been done, so to give a pat on the back for all the developer teams who are actually working on it. This is my last slide, and I basically wanted to end this with, security is not a destination; it's a journey of continuous improvements, and that is something we kind of realize. Every time we go through even our audits, because of a compliance program, we suddenly realize, how much more improvements we actually have to make to our security programs. And we also realize that from the huge security trends that we see across the improvements and the trends that we've actually seen across the board, as we educate ourselves, we see that we actually have to improve our program, and improve the items that we're actually working on it, to improve the security posture of the program itself. So some of the things that I would say that we actually are looking in our next journey, as we actually go, as we scale up, is, of course, the vulnerabilities and the SLA, improvements in the SLA, and how do we actually remediate? How do we better integrate with the engineering teams, with the sprint process, to address some of these vulnerabilities that we actually are working with? The second thing is, of course, customized training and education for teams, right? So like I said, building an awareness of security is extremely important. And The support of our executive leadership team, the board, the managers is extremely important. It's a top down, and it's as it comes down, it's extremely important to also make sure that we are providing the customized training and education for people depending on the audience that they are. We are a team of like data scientists, engineering, business, infrastructure, or DevOps. And so how do you actually cater some of these trainings to each of these different audiences? And that's kind of like what we are actually going to be focusing on in the next couple of quarters. The third one is security scorecards. This is something that I think we kind of like, this is a new thing, new concept that we are actually starting off with, where we are able to communicate quantifiable risk for different areas that we are basically monitoring. This is basically to give like an assessment of what the security posture looks like and what gaps we need to fill in the coming quarters. Because we are we are a startup and we're a fast-paced company, our roadmap has to be kind of very tightly packed or tightly, kind of solidified, so that we know exactly what we're working on within that quarter. The essence of this is to kind of give a sense of the risk of the security score so that it can help users, the end users decide, users decide that that they can, so that they can decide the trust and the risk of the security posture for their particular use case. And it's kind of educating them about that and giving them a sense of that perspective as well. And last but not the least, is security champions. If securities are always short staffed, and it's basically the amazing part of a team would be that if we can actually have security champions in individual teams that you're actually working with. And how do you actually designate some of those people within either the development team or the data science team or a couple of other teams? It's like having those hands available for you so that you can actually help your message can go basically further. Because security is not just about one individual. It's the team that makes it. It's not the individual that makes it. And that's kind of like where it's extremely important to have security champions, and that's kind of like where we actually want to strive towards in the next couple of years, that as we basically grow the company. With that, I wanted to thank you so much for this opportunity. I hope this was useful, and would welcome any questions that you may have.